There's a tremendous amount of growth happening in Ethiopia. It's a country which has had double-digit growth for about a decade now, and that has meant that urbanization has been growing very rapidly. Many cities are expanding dramatically with a lot of in-migration, and there's been a big program of urban renewal, and therefore that has meant that slum clearances, areas that have been considered to be in the center of the cities where the government wants to have a lot of the opportunities to attract private capital, to have big businesses, to have large skyscrapers, as well as the idea of improving the housing conditions of the urban poor. So there's a dual motive of urban regeneration and growth and attracting business on the one hand, and on the other hand, providing housing for the urban population, particularly the poor living in the center. And that's led to the establishment of large-scale housing programs called the condominium programs, with housing of 3 or 4 floors, both in the center and in the outskirts of the city. And this is going on not just in the capital city in Addis Ababa, but also throughout the country in the urban centers. So there's been a massive dynamism of urban growth. Amongst our urban population in the Young Lives sample, we have 3 sites that are in the center of, in the capital city, and another one in the capital of the southern region. So these communities are in the center, 2 of them are in the center in rather poor areas, in areas that are due for redevelopment and therefore are going to be knocked down. So we're very interested and very concerned about what's going to happen to the children and their families living in these areas that are no longer going to exist. In the 2 sites in the center of Addis and in the site in the center of the capital of the southern region, Hawassa, these communities are no longer going to exist in a few years' time. So we wanted to find out, first of all, what is it like to be living, for children and their families, what does it feel like to be living in these crowded conditions that are referred to often as slums? What's their experience of living in this kind of environment? And then what are they anticipating will happen to them when they have to move, when they're relocated? What are their hopes? What are their fears? What are their aspirations about the move, the relocation, and a new life afterwards? So that was what was behind it. Well, about the lives in the communities that they're living in now, the children had mixed feelings. On the one hand, they felt that the living conditions were ones that they disliked. So many of them live in a single room, sharing it with family members. So that means that they haven't got a separate toilet and separate kitchens. And so it's really crowded and rather unpleasant. The toilets are often shared and smelly. The sanitation is poor. Often there are open sewers with their toilets connected to this. So it's not very pleasant, and a rather the kind of environment that is not safe and not one that they feel comfortable living in. For girls, for instance, having to wash in areas that are not secluded or private is an additional constraint in the way they're growing up. On the other hand, they really like the closely knit family circumstances, being close to neighbors and friends, and that life, that community life living together is something we really value and appreciate about the conditions they're living in, and one that they're frightened might be affected or disrupted or disappear when they have to move. So they kind of have this mixed view. On the one hand, the sort of material conditions are rather tough and in some senses unpleasant, but on the other hand, the social life, the social fabric is something they really value and appreciate. Depends a bit where they move to. If they have the opportunity to remain in the center of the city where they're living, that is something that they would really like, partly because that's where their livelihoods are built. So very often most of these people are poor people. They live from livelihoods that are based on the informal sector. So it may be working in markets, in informal jobs in that particular area. That's where their livelihood is. For some women, for instance, it means they may be involved in producing food or drinks, and that works where they're living now. If, on the other hand, they have to move to the outskirts, to condominium housing outside the city, they're really worried that that would mean that they wouldn't find jobs, they wouldn't find opportunities for income-generating activities in these areas that are often new areas, and the cost of transport to come back and work in areas they used to live in might be prohibitive. So they're quite worried about the prospect of moving outside the areas that they're familiar with and ones where they might not have jobs. And for the children in particular, worries about being disrupted and no longer being with their friends, having to go to new schools, or the schools being far from where they live. So they're rather worried about those prospects. Well, particularly in terms of the condominium housing, there are quite a lot of concerns, partly to do with the physical structure of the buildings. So there are open staircases very often, and so that means that people are worried about the danger of children falling, and there have been tragic incidents. They're worried about the quality of the housing. This is low-cost housing. They're worried about having jobs and opportunities. So one major policy implication is that in thinking of new housing, it's not just the housing that matters, but what goes along with it. So whether there are services close by, and for children, daycare, and also for parents, daycare and kindergartens need to be thought through, and schooling and health, of course, so that when one is moving people to new areas, it's not just the physical infrastructure, the housing that matters and the quality of that, but also all the rest that goes with it, and in particular the question of whether there will be jobs and opportunities and income generation activities. So all that needs to be thought through if people are going to have to move far away. And of course, ideally, if people can be rehoused in areas close to where they've been living already, without breaking up the social networks that they value. For the children, that's really important, being close to their friends and so forth, and also for the adults, indeed, the work opportunities is particularly important. So if there are ways of trying to avoid too much dislocation and relocation, and where that has to happen, people being moved with friends, with groups, with communities, that's important. And if not, where they have to be relocated in areas that away from where they know, helping the rebuilding of social relations through their groups, their religious organizations, their funeral associations that are really important as support structures. And so thinking about the move not just as a physical one involving the building, and not just about the availability of work and employment and services, but also the social, trying to preserve and rebuild and reconstitute the social structure and the social support networks.